thank you for joining. This is the Yield Labs monthly series, and primarily focused on AgTech and growth from a global perspective. And so we're excited to have experts from around the St. Louis area and the globe chime in on what's happening with AgTech. And we're fortunate to be in St. Louis, where this is one of the AgTech centers of the world, and we're lucky to have the Yield Lab team here. And especially thankful today to have Brandon Day with the Yield Lab and Anastasia as well with Regrow, part of the Yield Lab network and portfolio. And Brandon, I'll just let you take it from here and get, give us take us home.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler, for the kind introduction. Again, thank you all for joining us here on this Thursday evening. Again, as Tyler said, this is the Yield Lab series, AgTech series brought to you by Venture Cafe St. Louis. So every third Thursday of the month, we get to highlight a founder in the Yield Lab global network of startups. Actually, today's talk is brought to you by the Institute, where I sit. And again, I'm Brandon Day, the Chief Operating Officer of the Institute, which is the nonprofit arm of the Yield Lab Group. And what we do is we focus on supporting early seed stage AgTech startups through targeted initiatives and in the nonprofit realm through things like open innovation challenges, ecosystem assessments, research and technical papers in AgTech, really trying to promote and foster more innovation in the space, support startups and founders really in AgTech, and trying to help them thrive and grow and really scale and grow. That's really our target mission, in tandem with the Federation of Funds at Yield Lab around the world that you all are likely familiar with. And so I'm really thrilled to bring you all today, Dr. Anastasia Volkova. The connection with Anastasia and her startup Regrow Ag is actually through the Soy Innovation Challenge, initiative we just wrapped up a month or so ago, which was an open innovation challenge really to promote innovations in the soy value space that capture more value directly back to soy farmers. And that was done in partnership with the USB, the United Soybean Board, Syngenta, Amazon Web Services, and the ICO group. And so for us, it really represented a really interesting opportunity to really get into the innovation space in soy and really connect farmers with key startups and founders just like Anastasia to really promote growth, value, and really think about technology to help really those stakeholders that really are at the ground level. And so today's talk is entitled actually Navigating Changing Markets, Growth and Acquisitions. And so you'll hear really some interesting background from Anastasia, from founder of the original startup she created, FluroSat, out of Australia, and then eventually growth and scale into North America, and then most recently the acquisition and merger with Dagan that became what's now known as Regrow Ag. And so I'm excited to share with you all a little bit about Anastasia and her journey and her background. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to her to give you a little bit about herself and give a brief bio on her. So Anastasia, please.
Thank you so much, Brandon and Venture Cafe, for having me. I'm excited to speak to everyone today. So as Brandon mentioned, I am a CEO of Regrow right now, and one of the co-founders effectively, because we did, as FluroSat acquired Dagan and formed Regrow. So the business that I started, FluroSat, started in Australia in 2016, and we were focused on delivering decision support tools for agronomists with a variety of solutions, including nitrogen recommendation maps and crop monitoring, crop stress detection, which of course have their versions today that are upgraded. But we've also felt that although we're making a really good impact in agronomy, when we met the team at Dagan, who were doing some great soil health modeling work and really environmental outcomes is where the strengths of their modeling and technologies were, we felt that the two were just made to be together. You need to have agronomic decision support for holistic outcomes. And we met in August last year. We agreed on the deal relatively quickly, and I'm sure we'll dive deeper into that with Brendan. We announced Regrow as a new brand, as a new company name to claim our larger mandate to help regrow the potential of agriculture to be a very positive climate actor. And this is what we stand for. Excited to be with you all today and thrilled to have a conversation with Brendan.
Yeah, thanks, Anastasia. And before we get started, because I've got quite a few questions to preempt the discussion, but if you've got questions for Anastasia or or, please put them in the chat, or feel free to, chime in. We're not a shy group here at Venture Cafe St. Louis. I did want to open up just to, set the stage and, if you would get a little bit more into detail on FluroSat, how it came to be, how the launch was in Australia, and then, eventually your scale into North America and growth into those other global markets. I'd love for you to share those insights with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So FluroSat is probably can be counted as my most recent startup, but I was in the startup space I have been in quite some time. I have started getting involved in startups back when I was studying. I felt that there were opportunities in the technology space, and that was my kind of formal training as an aeronautical engineer. We did a lot of code. This is what engineering is. You work a lot with systems and you program them. And so a lot of applications that we saw around ourselves, unless you're going to go and work for a space agency or some kind of defense organization, would be in the for-profit commercial technology sector. And I was interested in how do people build businesses in that sector. So I worked for large corporates early on for only a little bit to understand that was not for me. I was given a lot of responsibility very quickly, which is what I wanted, and I love that. But I've experienced the glass ceiling way too quickly, and felt that I would be capped at a very low level out of the potential that I thought I would be bringing to any organization. And so to balance that out, I started an entrepreneurship course. It was actually the one that Cisco gives through partner network of universities. And in that course, I was developing an idea of the business, and it was just impressively close to a business who one of the mentors of the course kind of very late down the track in the series was presenting his business that he started several years ago that was actually super similar. And I said, well, why don't I actually join him and learn? I have the energy and the enthusiasm and the interest to apply my best skills, and I want to understand the startup kitchen. I want to understand how to be a cook in it. I want to understand how would I actually, it's basically like someone's taking the risk for you. And I guess because I was so driven and just ready to roll up my sleeves and do BD work or project management work or whatever it was, I kind of relatively quickly got up to speed on how that organization was doing, for example, pipeline generation and business development activities. Then I joined startups more in the capacity of a project manager or product manager. So that was kind of my natural progression. I felt I wanted more ownership around the product, and I had the vision for what that could be. And then I realized that in those kind of startups and small tech companies, it wasn't necessarily that I was passionate about the application of that product. So I felt that this was great that I got to exercise this muscle and understand that that muscle is probably one of the strongest in me. I understood that the application of the product and the problem itself would actually be what drives me. The products that I was working on at that stage, so the earliest startup that I joined was in the language exchange space and connecting the tutors to learners. The ones that I joined later on were actually one of the large offshore contractors of Indeed that builds the job boards. And all of the machinery behind it and additional functionality as it scales and has different flavors of customizations in different markets. And it was actually working with a group of customers in the US. And so in a number of roles, I worked with customers around the world, really. So I understood that was what I was passionate about. In my academic career, I felt that I had something to finish. I took a PhD in Australia. Halfway through that PhD, I realized that I actually am lacking entrepreneurship. I went back to France from Australia for a short internship to kind of also understand what I want to do. And after coming back to Australia, I felt like, okay, we're starting the business with this. Like the insight of what I'm doing in my PhD should apply to what people want outside the world of academia. And I started testing that idea, called up a bunch of agronomists, went to the field with them, and figured that actually they did not have the tools that I wanted to build. And they were interested in them. And luckily, that was a really good year crop-wise in Australia, and they had the cash to spend, and they had the time and the interest. And so partly lucky weather patterns, because they can be really, really cruel. So luckily that year they had a ton of cash. And when I actually landed in Australia, experience, it was like the rainiest year on record in a certain time, and I'm like actually was moving there for the sunny, beach type of experience. So it was interesting. It was a poor experience for someone who was expecting sun, but great experience in ag. And someone who started the business in ag, I benefited from having early customer investment that then drove interest from venture. Then we went to TechCrunch, took second place on Startup Battlefield in Australia, closed the first investment of seed from two of the major funds down under that also have great connections in America. Then 2 years in, Australia hit drought, terrible drought. I took the business to the US and basically said, yes, we will retain something in Australia, but we need to be a business that's resilient. We never built it just for Australia. I wanted it to be an international platform. We had a team in Europe from the get-go, so we were distributed straight away as well, not only, but as well as in Australia. And fast forward, FluroSat had good traction, 26 million acres, 45 countries. December last year, made a decision to join forces with Dagan, and this is where I'm at.
Interesting. Yeah, and one thing for you too, Anastasia, the audience we have here at Venture Cafe, a lot of them are founders or folks looking to pivot in a new career, a new industry, and thinking about, do I want to start like my idea or my business? So I think that's a really interesting story that you saw an opportunity in a new emerging crop services market. You took a chance, and it wasn't something that you were trained, if you will, right, or you had a experience in. So I'm just curious. I'd love for you to share some insights for folks there who are listening in on thinking about that. How do you navigate a new industry or new environment like that? That's foreign. That's you have to really learn on the fly.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of learning on the fly. It's like literally in my Sydney office, the team still sometimes visits, says books and books on agronomy of this, on agronomy of that. I was basically getting a degree in agronomy whilst I was still writing my thesis in already growing the company, because I felt like I needed to be on par in the understanding of different concepts with the customers, because if we're building advisory tools, we really need to know what we're talking about. And if I were to ever hire a great scientist who better than me, I'm a remote sensing engineer scientist, and of course I needed a lot of agronomists and the agricultural scientists and modelers on my team. So I think, Brandon, to your question on how to navigate it, I think it's I heard it from an investor who really wants to invest in our company, and they're great. I definitely think we're still considering who we're going to take the money from, but we're very close to making a decision. I heard from them two days ago this something that I didn't think of myself, but now when it sounded as it rang true. They said, well, you're not a typical ag person. It's like you're kind of more of a typical SaaS person who cares about the environment so much, and you kind of had the affinity to ag, so you knew how it's done. Not from the commercial deep ag perspective at all, more from a perspective of here's my grandmother's veggie patch and my godmother has a potato farm and I've maybe dug potatoes once there. Like more of that affinity. I was like, oh, we're driving by and here's sunflower fields. Like more from that perspective that I just know what the food looks like rather than knowing how to manage it and when to apply herbicide. I have no idea about those things. Oh, I had no idea until I had to learn. Navigating that industry though was probably something that came from the conviction that there is something wrong, that I have the technology and tools that I think are clearly addressing this question that they all have, and they still don't have a way to solve it. And I think the most important advice that I would give that I religiously follow is really prove it by getting customer money. Like if they're not paying it, they don't care about it. Or like the thing that maybe they care about it, and maybe, you know, in different countries you have budgets that are there to spend for R&D, so it also can be very elusive. But what you really need to figure out is there a business model? So like, is there a problem that someone is willing to pay for at the price point at which you're delivering it, through the workflow through which you're delivering it? And is there a distribution channel that allows you to build a business? And it all kind of one by one. You can't solve them all at once. It's kind of, you solve one and then you hit the other one and you hit the other one. You kind of incrementally solve those problems. But if you don't think about it from the get-go, you just build something because you feel like it, I don't think this is a de-risked investment. And the only way that I see to de-risk a new business is to effectively do kind of the Amazon way, like write a press release and then make it happen. You know, like envision what you want to build or create, get customers buying, and then kind of do it. And almost like do it just as you're getting the buy-in, not ahead of time. Don't build something in a dungeon by yourself or, you know, with a group of people, and then think of offering it to someone. Like, you need to understand the problems you're trying to solve. And unless you represent the user group yourself and you're convinced it is a big market, it represents a risk that you want to manage.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a great lesson learned, not just in AgTech, but just, you know, startups in general. That's a great point. Melissa, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just would love to just hear a little bit more detail, kind of down that same path, Anastasia, because, you know, one of the big differences, I think, that when I went from being part of a clean tech startup that was much more of a traditional life science business model where you raise a bunch of venture capital at the beginning and then your risk is the science and you spend all this time de-risking the science, but the business model is unknown. Once the science works, the business model, you know how to commercialize this. And then the last 6 years I've been working with tech, you know, true tech, you know, like software tech kind of startups, and where the business model is the risk. You're trying to figure out, okay, what's the best problem to solve and what do my customers need? And there's this much more continuous innovation loop on the business model. So when you're in so often when we do work with either ag tech or health tech or something where the science and the software sort of have this intersectionality, people have less or more comfort with. So I would love to hear your origin, like at the very beginning. How did you get that customer traction, and were you ever felt like you had to wait on the science side, why the soft, but you know what I mean? Like, try to marry that.
Yeah, I hear you. It's a great question, and you're hitting the nail on the head here. Being, you know, ag tech is very close to life sciences because it is, you know, not clinical trials, but almost. It's as close as you can get by being outside of it. And we were, I recognized that early on, and we were lucky that we actually had the startup incubator coming out of life sciences. They have a very strong life sciences program that I joined with FluroSat. And I kind of made that decision that if they can get clinical trials right, if we can accelerate that tenfold, I think this can be ag. And that's what it takes. Because I actually did 2 accelerators. First, I did a technical one, and they're like, okay, I mean, they're really pushing me to get customers. Okay, I'll go and get customers because that traction is really important. But once you get the traction with customers and the 3 months or they go by, you enter this period of, okay, so now we need to start figuring out the science, doing the trials, collecting the data, incentivizing, managing, doing product, like creating protocols around that data collection, and so on and so forth. So that's like literally how it was. I entered the Tech Accelerator first, and I set a goal, which was, look, they've given us $25,000 investment. It's matched funding with state government in Australia, so those give you 25. If you apply for it, we got 50 to spend. We bought a camera for 28. It's a hyperspectral camera, so it's like a lab device that is very expensive. We bought some other equipment like drones to fly it on to do trials, and we started going out to well, that was just like after we started getting traction with agronomists, not immediately the day after they gave us the money. But going out to agronomists and explaining to them, so like we built a really lo-fi prototype of the tool. We called it FluroViewer. That was like the predecessor of FluoSense, which now is a pretty known in the industry platform that is connected to all the farm management systems, etc. So we kind of, I've built something like that with my technical the engineer who basically was my first hire, and I gave him the science logic. I kind of hacked it on the napkin, and I did the processing kind of on Python on my own computer, and then exported the files. And the products is what we were showing. So the maps is what we were showing. And I remember being in those conversations where it's like, okay, if it's a nitrogen map of my fields, how we can go and ground truth it, and how can we approach it from a perspective of let's do the trials, let's validate it, let's publish. So that was happening in parallel to needing to develop a system that actually was solving the problem and has the workflow that allows them to, like there's an adoption problem as well as a science validity question. And so you kind of need to be solving for both at the same time. And once you go deeper on the science, you need to advance your adoption. And I think gradually that's how people get more and more comfortable with it, and you get better with it. Like you can't be doing one and not the other. And I remember the advice that I got from the CEO of that incubator. She's brilliant. She's not with them anymore, but she told me when we were raising our first money, and one of the first customers wanted to invest, she told me, you know, it's so unique that the customer wants to invest almost straight up, and you came up with this idea, and you're definitely onto something, and that customer can catalyze the venture capital to flow in. And so you go and what she said was just go and do what they need you to do. That was the best advice in capital raising at an early stage I've ever gotten. Because if they're not comfortable with the science, go and hammer on science. If they're not comfortable with the projections you have, go and tell them why you got to them. If they're not comfortable with the use of proceeds, you go and talk to them about it. Like it's feels like a bit of a whack-a-mole game, but it's a limited number of whacks that you need to do. Like it's not endless. And that's the good point, because it feels at some points like, oh, yet another thing. And I remember like when we were almost ready to close the first close was, oh, and that customer was like, oh, the drone broke and the camera fell off and something else happened. We're like, okay, we have another one. It's going to be okay. But that day was a complete up and down of, oh, we're raising capital. Something really went wrong. It's a normal situation. Everyone is going through it. Every time you're almost like in this kind of stressful situation. I had a round where someone who was leading the science, they decided to leave the company. We're like, okay, it's a good idea that you decided to leave the company. We don't think it's a long-term fit, but it's bad timing. Like I'm trying to close the round here. And so keeping it together, being transparent, to just know that there will be a limited number of check boxes to tick. It's not unlimited. It's like, it's just really, I think it's a resilience. It really, the tenacity is the synonymous thing with entrepreneurship. You just need to believe that there will be a last box and it's done.
Yeah, no. But it's nice that you had an investor, that one that was smart money, that knew what you were doing, and also, created that loop of dialogue from that perspective, because that's what can get so frustrating, is when you feel like you're having to always put on a smiling face and everything's fabulous, and you can't just say, no, this was a really crappy day and I need my people and all the different, my investors, my customers, my coworkers, whatever, to rally, and let's be transparent about this roller coaster that is a startup.
I think what's important is that I actually don't ever put a smiley face just because. So like that was from the get-go. It's like, well, I like this human. I spend a lot of time with her in the fields, waking up at 6 a.m., going sampling cotton with her, figuring out why there's so much paper around her truck, like understanding her life, her work. Like this is the life of agronomist. And it's like understanding how to solve a problem for her and for her colleagues that she has. And then of course we're in the trenches. So like once you're in the trenches, it's like, and ag is very, very frank, like they're very direct, they can be abrasive, but at the same time, they don't lie. And I think with investors, I've chosen people who I felt I had a connection with. So our first investor on the institutional side from the venture capital, he actually was my mentor in that first accelerator. And I said, I need you to help me build this business. This is what you've done this thing before. You've done this thing before. You spun out a deep tech company at an Australian science agency. You helped this other deep tech company in an adjacent industry grow. Like you clearly have it. And we kind of clicked, luckily, on the personal level. And then he got a job to run a fund, and this is how he got an investor. But I think it's about that relationship, and it's about being true. I don't believe that anything good can come out of not having transparency in the boardroom. Like, it's just not a good start. Then you need to have back channel conversations, and I don't have, not me personally, I don't have time for it. So we need to have like the straight talk straight up, because I'm not gonna be up all night to have like full-on conversations.
Right.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I did want to follow up on your earlier point, Anastasia. You talked about when you built FluroSense and the products, you thought about not just the home market, Australia, but also global markets and thinking about scale. I'm curious, can you get a little bit more into details on that, as let's share some lessons learned, if you will, what that entailed?
Yeah, Brandon, great question. I think starting from the original idea that if you have one market, and agriculture has only one, Australia has 2 seasons, but it's still like you kind of, if you do a certain crop types, and as a startup, you need to start somewhere, so you commit to a certain, say, crop type and a certain type of application. So we were doing nitrogen in cotton, and then we evolved into doing nitrogen and fertilizer prescriptions or nitrogen status mapping in cereals. But for us to get to cereals, like the reason why we understood that that's important is to have like the full year rotation. You can't have a SaaS business with regular revenue, MRR, ARR style revenue, if you do not have customers who need you all around, all year round, every month, and so on. And so when you look at it from a perspective of geography, crop type, seasonality, agriculture is calling for the double, like 2 hemisphere plan. That's what people usually call it. Like an AgTech startup needs to have a 2 hemisphere plan, because if you're not, like, there's just such an opportunity to leverage what's happening with that same crop type in a different geography in an off season for your primary geography, or vice versa. That is just infinitely more appealing to make a tool that can get applied in different geographies. Like we have 5 major land mass objects on the map where we can throw this stuff at, and they're pretty much all either off cycle or slightly misaligned to each other. So you have more. We used to say that we have more shots at it. That's why we would want it to do global, because it's like, well, if it doesn't rain or there's no water allocation in this part of the world, you're not going to have a run of your system. No one's going to want you to deploy it. And that was specifically because you can't start everywhere at once. So you start somewhere, but then it limits you in terms of your applicability. So if you could start not with nitrogen tools, but with absolutely everything, then maybe you have a less risk of one of those things becomes irrelevant because the weather is playing out a certain way. But if you build a narrow tool and then start stacking crop types and then start expanding over geographies, like it's a kind of a natural projection that you feel you need to de-risk your business. And when Australia went into drought, that was obvious. Like I needed to pack the bags, call on the partners, and get them to introduce me to folks who farm on this side of the ocean and ask them questions around, okay, what do you need this tool? How do you need this tool? How can we adapt it to your operation? How does a cotton in Central Valley grow compared to cotton in Australia? How can we make it usable? Oh, you have 12 crop types, not just 2 or 3 like they do in Australia. Okay, let's look at that. And you kind of gradually pick your battles, but it's just a foresight is required to de-risk things in agriculture, because they're just so weather related that if you're dependent on one source at one location for your market traction, is just too risky.
That's a great point. Yeah. And I did want to, before I ask my next question, pause for a moment and see if we have any questions from the listeners or just the audience or in general. Looks like we do have one. This is from Kent Lynn. It says, how would you establish a more personal connection with potential investors, like you mentioned? Yeah, if you could, go into a little bit more detail about that, Anastasia. I did love those points you made about your board and board members and your first investors, the first folks.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Even now, when we're are raising our next round, or we're at the point where our growth is attracting new capital, it's important to establish that personal connection. I feel, well, every leader is different, but these are people. It's like, you know, taking investments and getting married. Like, you need to know what's going on and what's happening, what you're likely to get yourself into, because these people will have expectations of you. You will have expectations of them. You're going to be in the trenches together. You would want to create something that will withstand the hurricanes and the stock market plummets and other things. So you need more brains around the table to be on your side if the market is on the other side. So you playing against the market, you'll win, or you gradually win by chipping away at it. So establishing personal connection with investors, I guess I am as true on this call as I am on the VC introduction call. And it just starts there. Like, I'm not going to be someone who I'm not. And I think it sets the stage for the level of interaction, for the type of connection that you're looking for. I think accepting that you, and I sometimes have a hard time accepting it, because now I lead a company of 50 people, and sometimes feels like, well, I'm the responsibility barrier carrier for absolutely everyone and everything ultimately. And so it sometimes feels like I need to know all the answers. Even if I have a mature leadership team, they would sometimes say, I don't know what to do about it. Like, well, that's not an answer we should accept of in this situation. So let's go and figure out what we need to do. And especially because I work with scientists, so this is what they can say sometimes. Like, the business leaders, of course, will go and start chipping away at it, start testing hypotheses. But with scientists, it's like, oh, okay. But it can be reversed in other situations, so it's a balance. But I would say that with investors, it's very similar. You don't need to feel like you need to know all the answers. In many situations, they ask you questions, and this is crucial, because they're curious how you think. And what I heard from my investors consistently, and from very good people who were my advisors, who are not direct investors, but investors and advisors into other into other companies who are unicorns. We're not yet. They often say coachability is the #1 quality of the founder. I did talk about tenacity and resilience. That's just important for you as a leader. If you're getting yourself into something like this, like, you will be responsible and you will have nowhere to run. And with my personality that suits me, like, I want to take responsibility proactively, like, as we discussed in my very first story. Like, I quit corporate because there was not enough responsibility to take per paycheck. Whilst if you're looking at investor relationship, they're a coach, and like, you're choosing yourself a coach. And this is why I said that I chose my mentor as a coach. Like, I saw that he had the insight into things I wanted to build that I didn't yet know how to build. And life is too short to make all of the mistakes on yourself. You need to leverage the knowledge that people have around you. So when an investor asks you a question, so how do you think about the TAM for this market, like for this solution, total addressable market? Like, of course, maybe if it's your 50th time that you're hearing this, you should know the answer. But if it's the first time you're hearing this question, you can say, well, when I hear TAM, I think of these aspects. And this means that if we have this multiple in our business one pricing model, I would dive deeper into that and dissect it, et cetera, which is not a direct answer as to this is a $5 billion market, because then you need to actually know what you say after that. So it's important to understand that people ask questions, and it sometimes feels like you're being grilled when you're in this conversation, but it's actually an opportunity to build that connection. So thank you for that question. And that would be my way of building connection, to be authentic, to be and say, hey, actually, it's great that you're asking me. I was thinking of getting to do some of the work on this topic. Like, everyone knows entrepreneurs are very busy. And you can say, this is how I think about it, but what do you think of that? Like, you can immediately ask for feedback, for input. I think what they don't want to see and don't want to hear is arrogance, and they don't want to see and don't want to hear, which is the opposite of coachability, I would say, in some regard. And then they also don't want to see you making assumptions and statements that are completely don't stand to any validation, any kind of pressure, So that's just an example that comes to mind of how you can do these things. And there's no reason why you can't go and have coffees with them, like we actually did with this investor who I kind of keep bringing up, who's looking at putting the money into Regrow now. We actually did go for, what was it, like a Saturday afternoon lunch with them, and this was recent. So yes, we are in kind of COVID central in California here, but it is possible to social distance and have lunch and kind of understand how you behave outside of Zoom room. Not saying it's required. It's just that don't think that anything's off limits.
Yeah, no, I think you brought up some really great points that I'm sure you've probably been peppered with questions from investors or others about things that you just don't know about, but that's okay, right? I think being authentic and being upfront about that actually is probably, I think, a strength, and it reveals to them that you're the type that will find out, and you'll seek out help, when you need to, right?
Yeah, it's because that's the behavior that you will always, as a business, you will be bumping into things you don't know. Like a business model innovation is actually, as Melissa was saying, like that's what we do day to day. Like my best job and the best, what I pride myself in, is figuring out the business model of this business that is smart, elegant, beautiful. It works, it feeds on itself. It does take a lot of work to build all the parts so it works like a smooth machine, but you are constantly bumping into unknowns, and constantly the environment is changing. So Brandon, to your point, like if this is how you answer questions normally, if this is how you will behave when you encounter the unknown, you will think about it, you will suggest your course of actions, you will inquire about potential other options with advisors who you trust. That's what they want to see, and this is who they want to give money to, not someone who would be, kind of enclosed and really paralyzed by this uncertainty that this question poses.
Yeah.
Brandon, can I just add one thing to what Anastasia said?
Please do.
Just in reading through Kent's question too, I guess it obviously depends on what the funding source is. So, there's different opportunities, there's grants and there's, true equity investors and those sorts of things. But regardless, I think across the board, looking for opportunities to be in the same room with people long before you need their money. So just like look, whether if it's an accelerator, yeah, you might just be an application of hundreds that pop up in their thing. But if you've gone to an event of theirs, if you've done things throughout a year, if you've paid attention to what they've posted on social media and interacted with that and started to create connections with people, if it's a granting agency, if, looking for those opportunity windows where you can build relationships with program managers during the open periods. And so you're not just an application anymore, you're a person. And we all know that people invest in people, they don't invest in companies and technologies, because we've all seen, fabulous technology run into the ground by the wrong person. But the other way, flip side of that, amazing people can take technology and do great things with it. So I think just looking for those opportunities, like you said, Anastasia, just building that relationship long before you need anything from them.
Yeah, I can't stress that enough. And I was just looking at the question a little bit more in detail, and I think what Kent is getting to is that, sometimes you the only context that you engage with investors or folks like that is when you're asking for money, right? I think that's a key point too, is sometimes you just want to get to know them first, right? And not think about an ask or an agenda or anything else, right? And the other thing too, I think Anastasia can speak to this from her experience as well, is I've noticed too, is just because they say no doesn't mean that they won't make introductions to their friends or others, or they won't say yes later. So just a no now doesn't mean it's a no ever. So I'm love to hear Anastasia's perspective on that as well.
Yeah, you're totally spot on. And I would also say that here's a rule to expand what Melissa said. I kind of like this, since I retain short pieces of information, shorter than Twitter. So the first one being, if you ask for advice, you'll get money. If you ask for money, you'll get advice. Like that is a golden rule, stands always, works always with all VCs, all funding agencies, everyone ever, especially America. So literally what this means is that if you want to, like, why do you want someone to engage with you? Because you think they have something to offer. Is it just money? Well, if you want dumb money, so to speak, like no one wants to be representing dumb money. If you need dumb money, you go to the bank, and it's like they don't care about you, don't care about them. You get the loan, you're done. If you are in the VC world, what every VC funds talks about is their differentiation. This is what the first thing I ask every VC, whoever wants to talk to me. Some of the calls I just don't take if they're not like introduced to me by my network. What I ask them about is, what's your value proposition? So they all see themselves as being able to add additional value, their insights, their connections, their network. So wouldn't you want to benefit from that regardless of them wanting to give you money? And so literally what this turned into, even Brandon, to your previous question of navigating ag industry, I did this with scientists as well. Not just to hire them, but actually to get them to work with me. I would come and tell me, I think you're the best person for this. I have these questions. There's 10 people identified who are ready to hear about the solution to this. Can you tell me why answers to these 3 questions? And then I will go and dig more and learn more. So you can do the same thing with the VCs, where you're not exactly coming and asking scientific questions, but you are best opportunities are to come and ask for feedback on business model, feedback on your go-to-market approach. Those are kind of the key 2 that everyone seems to have an opinion on always. And it's generally something that can be debated forever. Like it's never perfect. And so you can kind of improve it. And they will ask you very interesting things. They will give you ideas about how to make additional money, about where to go and target. Like I can't tell you enough, like I have a bunch of these VC calls and they're all laid to the table, but they're great humans to meet. And so I often say, well, this is not the right time, maybe, or, like realistically, I don't want to confuse you that we're raising right now, like we're actually, closing, etc. But I would love to meet you to understand where you stand in the market. And it seems like we're trying to fight for the same cause and we're standing behind the same ideas. So let's exchange them. Like, this is what we do. And they still ask me questions. How do you differ from this? And how do you think about that? How would you benefit from the growth of this trend in this market? And those are some of the ideas that if you don't engage with someone at that level, when you don't ask their critical feedback on your business, you're never going to activate their brain. And this is such a great thing. You just get their feedback. So this is why I'd ask for advice. And then maybe you start building the relationships as a part of which they feel they can bring value. And as a part of that, they usually will bring money.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love the point too you made. That's really super sneaky, where you're asking the scientists or folks to for input or trying to solve a problem, and then before you know it, they become an employee of yours, and they're like, "Well, how did I end up here working with you?"
I didn't necessarily
right?
do that. It was more science collaborations in the sense that they remain where they are, and we just kind of cut them money so that they can keep doing the research with us, because they want impact, we want better research, everyone's better off. I don't think I've hired anyone quite like that, but I needed validation in the early stages because I was not an agronomist. And hence what Melissa was asking, like, how was I balancing the science validity versus the product validity? I was hammering on, I'll be able to attract the right scientists to tell me the useful things so I could incorporate them. And hence I needed to practice that muscle before. Like, I never hired anyone, they're too senior for me. But one of them licensed the tool he's built so I could incorporate it, stood behind me on the press release, and it kind of started rolling from there. So yeah,
no, that's awesome, and great question by Kent. And again, please, if you've got questions for Anastasia, please put them in the chat, or please unmute yourself as we're going along. I do want to get into the other part of this, and I'd love for you to share, which is the potential as you're a founder or startup, and there might be an opportunity to merge with another one. And I'd love for you all to share that journey with this group, Anastasia, on how that came to be with Dagan. What that process was like. What did you consider, and why was Dagan the right choice, and how does that synergistically help you grow and scale going forward?
Yeah, and this is actually our second acquisition. So the first acquisition was Productionwise in Australia. So grain growers were divesting their platform, the farm management platform that supports still a lot of grain growers in Australia and all arable farmers in New Zealand. And so that was my first experience of acquiring something and understanding what implications it has: integration of technology, integration of culture, integration of people. They're quite different. in the sense that Productionwise was more of a technology acquisition, and the team wanted to kind of disperse themselves, like they didn't necessarily want to be a part of the startup. Whilst with Dagan, it was all very natural fit in a sense that this fits into my idea of the world and where we are going as Regrow. Like, what product did I want to build? I started building a product that I learned later they already had. So that, to me, felt like this was meant to be, because I'm someone who doesn't want to waste time, energy, and resources if I can just get it off the shelf and be better than anyone else and bring it to market, building more value with it. And so, because we were already feeling that our customers needed, we were getting requests, we were starting to build it, and then we met a team that had made really great progress and had some significant traction and very good backers behind them. You know, the Nature Conservancy was using and blessing that product, and a bunch of private organizations as well. So it's like, whoa, wow, we really can't go better than that in the space of time that we think we'll need to compete. And we didn't want to compete with them, but it was more like just a normal situation where you started building something, when you're experimenting with it internally, you weigh out what you need to invest versus what they have. And that's the question, really. Like, is the 1 + 1 = 3? Like, can you create a bigger future where the synergies of the products will really drive, not hypothetically, but very specifically? Like, you need to be able to explain how in the next 12 to 24 months, the P&L will improve. Like, you will be getting, like, from these customers, this additional product request. Maybe it's an upsell, cross-sell, maybe it's opening new markets. And it's because we had those customer requests, plus like a little bit, not as much as for our core product, of course. And we had the conviction that this is where the market was going and this was the right thing to do. It kind of fit within this was quite lucky. Like, it fit within my product view of, like, in 3 years, this is what I wanted to get to. And if we wanted to be able to shortcut that and join forces with someone who was bringing all the science and rigor in this additional space where we did not have the science expertise, and what they wanted is strong executive leadership. They were looking for a CEO. They were looking for a technical team to help them scale their science. And we had that, and we offered that, and we came and said, like, we actually do want to scale you. Like, we adore your science. This is so beautiful. Like, we need to take it to market. Like, we will do everything. Like, we will hire people, put them around you. Like, that's what we should do. We talk to all of your customers. They think it's a great idea. Well, through them introducing us, of course, not in a different way. But that's how you kind of get to that. And I would say the Productionwise acquisition was quite different. It was like, okay, so here's this data vault opportunity. Here's a bunch of customers, and here's some good tools that we can leverage, learn from, and as a business, try to grow our primary business of analytics, leveraging this asset. And would this asset give us more value in the long term through relationships with primary customers, of which there's a few corporates and few kind of more government organizations? Will those strengthen our P&L as well? It came with some recurring revenue that was covering for its own expenses, for its support and development. So it was something that we just needed to make sure that it didn't divert all of our focus, that we still knew how to support it, maintain it, and how to do the best that we could for those customers. So we basically, like, took it into our custody in a way, and looked at opportunities how to advance. And an interesting opportunity that brought to us is that we were and are supporting the Foundation of Arable Research in New Zealand, FAR, and they're very forward-looking in sustainability. And so because we bought Productionwise, we've implemented the carbon calculators and the nitrogen calculators for them straight into their farm management tool that we maintain and technically call ours, but if we think it's more theirs because it's for them. Before this whole hype in the US even happened. And so who knew that buying another unrelated thing 3 years ago would actually lead to becoming the first ever developer of this complex thing that you can use all of the farm management system information to run it by the sustainability metrics and get a report for a farmer that kind of seals their the soundness of their environmental practices. Like that's beautiful. Like we felt that we liked that customer and we would be willing and interested in experimenting with things for them. And they led us to this discovery that later on led us to understand that's actually a very important part where we should invest more. So by the time the US market picked it up, we were already educated on it. We already deployed the tool. We already knew what it should look like. And we're still not there in the US. Like we'll probably in 2 years, we'll start talking about that tool that we've already built in New Zealand a couple of years ago. And we will eventually, because that's where I think inevitably we're going. So the merger should make sense. You can't just kind of assume, and we turned down some options. Like there were companies that I'm not sure how they're doing now. I think they're raising, but throughout COVID, there's definitely been a lot of shaking out and kind of consolidation in AgTech, as y'all have seen. So we had to say no to some deals that just didn't make sense. Even picking that company apart would not, like we wouldn't be able to operate that business model, or we wouldn't be able to operationalize what they had as technology. Like you need to feel strong synergy and really see how it all fits into your customer's head as well.
Yeah, that's some great points, I think. And the other thing too, I was going to ask, I'll pause here just a moment to see if there's any questions from the audience or the viewers while we get a sip of water or anything. I know you mentioned that the Dagan acquisition was just, it made sense because they were looking for a strong leadership team and a CEO. And I was actually going to ask my question about that potential when you're thinking about merging two startups and trying to blend teams and leaderships and founders, right? Sometimes founders have a very alpha personalities, or can be exactly you're doing the exact motion I was going to do. And I was just curious about if you encountered that, but it didn't sound like you did. But I would love for you to share kind of lessons about that, about that process.
Yeah, no, Bill and I are like peanut butter sandwich. Like we're great together. We're different. We respect each other. I got to love him very quickly. He's very kind and gentle and very strong. I have a lot of admiration for someone who had such conviction for all these years to be commercializing the science that now is at the cusp of bringing the monitoring, report, and verification to the entire carbon space in the US, if not globally. Like it's just beautiful. Like that's his dedication to science. And so he was an interim CEO. They tried another CEO before. So there was a tendency, at least there was a track record of him not wanting to be an alpha and him wanting to kind of divest some of that, of the running around that CEO has to do all the time, and actually focus on the science, focus on the protocols, focus on people getting the carbon right, people getting the sustainability right. And that's how we divide and conquer. And I am trying as much as I can to build systems, to bring resources around him, so it's easier to scale, so it's more repeatable, etc. So we did not have a clash at all. It's very lucky because he's a true scientist and I'm not. I'm an entrepreneur, and he's very entrepreneurial. He's not his first company, so he established several companies before and spun out this one with a goal to do product. But I think it's because he didn't necessarily come from product background and in just SaaS business. He didn't necessarily know how that kitchen needs to be laid out. It's like McDonald's. You need to have efficient design of the business. Like you kind of need everything in the right place. Whilst if you're a scientist, you have a lot of experimentation going on, and it can result in not necessarily narrow focus for the business that you absolutely have to have if you're building a product-based SaaS company, even if it's in deep tech and life sciences space. Thank you so much. Gonna run and talk to the investors. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Good to see you, Brandon.
Thanks, you too.